anytime you create a opportunity for a new discussion, people get excited about it. But if you don't provide them the opportunity to have the discussion in an organized manner, then they'll just go have the discussion somewhere else. So what we're trying to do is create exactly that, create a forum for the discussion.
You're listening to Relish This, the Purpose Marketing Podcast. Here's your host, Stu Swineford.
Hey everybody, Stu here. I had a super fun exploration on Relish This today with Bill Woolf, founder and president of the Space Force Association. At the SFA, they're helping to build awareness around the importance of having a strong, protective presence as we develop more and more technologies and activities based outside of the Earth's atmosphere. Bill and I talked about ways to engage people early in their exploration into the realm of space and how each phase of the audience engagement cycle is important in transitioning people from interested to fully engaged with one's organization. I think this was a really fun episode. There were some technical difficulties with some lag, so bear with us, but I hope you really enjoy it. Here we go. Hey, Bill, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you so much, Stu. I really appreciate you having me on the show, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So tell us a little bit about what you have going on down there. It sounds like you just moved to Montana from the Springs. I went to school in the Springs, so I'm familiar with that area, but I've actually never had the opportunity to visit Montana. So where are you located now?
I am in Wolf Creek, Montana, and that's because we bought property years ago when my wife and I were stationed up here at Malmstrom Air Force Base and just fell in love with Montana. And so we bought property years ago, and now I thought it was a pretty good time to come on up and start building out on the property and, spending some time, in nature. But yeah, Colorado Springs is where Space Force Association is headquartered. We're an international organization focused nationally right now with our membership development, and happy to talk more about the Space Force Association and what we're doing.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more and hear a bit about what how you're driving that membership piece.
Yeah, so I retired from the military a couple of years ago. And my profession in the military was space operations. And I started out in my military career as a missile launch officer and then transitioned into space when they opened up the availability to transition into the space community. And so I transitioned into space probably around 2000 and spent the majority of my career working in space operations.
Okay.
And the biggest thing, I didn't know when I was working on the mission that I was working on. At the time, it was a secure communication system. I didn't know how the system was developed. I didn't know how to evolve the system. I didn't understand the feedback mechanism by which an operator like myself would be able to provide back to the acquisition community how to improve the system. And so when I retired, I thought, hey, this is going to be great working in industry, being able to talk back to the military and tell them all the good things that are going on. But that's just not the way things operate. And so I figured it would be great to stand up a membership-based professional organization focused on the space superiority mission. And that was about a month before the Space Force was stood up and established in November of 2019 is when Space Force Association.
So tell me a little bit more about the membership piece.
Yeah. So in order to get the narrative out, and really SFA is focused on educating folks about the Space Force and advocating for the national security space superiority mission. And so what we do is we host webinars and podcasts like what you're doing here and interviews. So we get the word out about what the Space Force is doing. So if you go to ussfa.org, you'll see videos that we've accomplished in the past with senior leaders from the Space Force so that the American public can turn to our organization to get information about the Space Force as opposed to turning towards Netflix. And that's how we drive our membership base, because people say, I'd like to learn more about what the Space Force is doing. And that drives to our website. And then they can become a member there and get content specifically designed for our membership base and by our members, actually.
So who are you trying to reach when you are trying to build your membership?
Yeah, it's anybody interested in the space domain. And so when I say the space domain, it's outer space, and
Okay.
there's a lot going on. I mean, the civil sector with
Mhm.
NASA, the commercial sector with industry, the academic sector, researching all the different opportunities in space and the
Mhm.
cislunar space environment. And so we're really and just the individual who's interested in learning more about space. That's really our target audience, is all of those folks who are trying to cover the gamut. And of course, that translates into ensuring that our policymakers understand the criticality of the space domain and the Space Force mission, because that really is what it comes down to. Unfortunately, this was turned into a political discussion under the previous administration and President Trump, and he turned it into a political
Mhm.
discussion. And this really isn't a political discussion. This is a national security discussion, and one that is, what I've heard folks say. It's not bipartisan. It's apartisan. It's not tailored to a specific political affiliation. It's a national security discussion. So those are our audience members, and that's who we're tailoring to, is just that wide swath of folks who are interested in learning more about the Space Force.
Yeah, and I would say that audience is fairly um, diverse. I mean, I know that I have friends who are interested in space travel versus like the tourism piece, as well as science and just exploration, and um, but people are kind of all over the board. Is there a way that you have narrowed down how you reach that audience or those different audiences?
Yeah. So our narrative, it's a pretty simple one. I think it's simple, because if you look at what we need to accomplish the space superiority mission, you really don't have to go that far to see how other domains accomplish domain superiority. And I say domain superiority, and really what I'm saying is each military
Hmm.
service, or every branch of the service, has a responsibility to protect and defend that domain. The Navy does the maritime domain. The Air Force does the air domain. The Army does the land domain. And so it just makes sense that you'd have a Space Force focused on the space domain. Now, the difference is in that whole narrative, we've had to fight battles in each of those domains. And so we know what each of those other services do. You can see tanks. They've had to fight through wars, and you've seen the capability and
Hmm.
advantage that those technologies have provided for that service. So it's not a real hard stretch to say, do we need more tanks and new technology in the Army? And of course, people say, yeah, we need the newest technology for the Army. Uh, but the difference is in the space domain, we've not had to fight through a space war to demonstrate the technology and the capabilities necessary for the space superiority mission. Every service will say, oh, well, we need more aircraft, or we need more tanks, or we need more battleships. All of that may be true, but it's really tough to visualize how many satellites you need and what expertise you need the operators to have to accomplish the space superiority mission, because we've not had to fight through a war in space, and hopefully we never have to fight a war in space. I don't think anyone wants a war in space, because I think it would be
Right.
bad for a lot of folks. That being said, we need to have the experts and the capabilities and the technological capacity to ensure that we can fight through a potential conflict that extends into space.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting concept in terms of how to approach that, and yeah, like you said, there are all these tangible um, infrastructures and equipments and personnel and all of these things in place that we're very used to for good or bad, but we can really wrap our arms around those assets where space is kind of science fiction. It's in the future, and it's interesting to hear how all this planning is going into, conceiving of what this thing may be, as opposed to being able to wrap our arms around, this very tangible construct.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you have a Netflix series that Steve Carell is out there talking about what his perception and interpretation of the story is, and just based on access, that's what people typically look at and say, this must be what the Space Force is all about. And that's just simply not true. I mean, there are, of course,
Yeah.
you can draw parodies on any service, but that's because what those other services are, and that parody is exactly that. Whereas the Space Force folks go, well, this must be exactly how the Space Force is as a service, but that's not true because we haven't had that many movies about folks in the Space Force and all the work that they're required to do. And so people look at Netflix and say, well, this must be how it is.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting challenge, I think, to overcome that. And it really comes down to, a lot of education, a lot of messaging, and getting the word out about what it is that how you guys see this evolving. So yeah, it's kind of like you're having to combat something that doesn't even exist. It's an interesting place to be, I think.
Yeah, and just so just for everyone's understanding, I'm speaking on behalf of the Space Force Association, and in no way affiliated with the Space Force or attempting to speak on behalf of the Space Force. This is this organization's interpretation of how we can help get the word out about the Space Force. So I just want to be clear on that as well.
Right. Is that coming down to just trying to build that user base and that membership, and speak to that membership, and then allow them to distribute information more fully and bring more people on board? Is that kind of part of your current mission?
Yeah, part of the mission is exactly that. If I look back at myself when I was a captain in the Air Force, and I look at the problems I faced coming up in the Air Force and trying to get the technology necessary to do my job, what we're trying to do is bring the tactician, the space warfighter, into the discussion and then elevate that conversation. And so in all military services, you've got this very understandable process where folks go and they train, they develop the technology, they train with that technology, they learn from that training best practices, and then they make recommendations to increase or evolve the technology. So that testing, training, tactics development is very well understood in the other services. And what we're trying to do at SFA is bring that conversation to light. How do these space warfighters do their job to ensure we as an American people believe and trust that they have everything they need to do their space superiority mission? So that's really the conversation we're trying to have. And if you look across social media, there's a lot of unorganized attempts to address these concerns. And what we're trying to do at SFA is organize the discussion, identify what the priorities are and help elevate those to our decision makers and lawmakers so that they can help advocate for a stronger Space Force to ensure our national security objectives can be met.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So are you lobbying as well? Is that part of the mission? Is there an interface with Congress and those types as well?
We are a 501c3, and so we are a private nonprofit, and really we don't have any lobbying base. Our only objective really is to provide documentation and education and advocacy. So we don't hire lobbying groups to go help. We just continue to highlight those critical discussions that we know need to happen because we're not coming off of a period in our history where we've had to demonstrate a space superiority mission, and defend and protect our assets in space and then have an all-out war, like we did in the last World War, where it was easily demonstrated that each domain was critical to our success as a nation. So we want to avoid that, but we still have to have those tough conversations without having the demonstrated conflict in the space domain. We definitely don't want that. So yeah, we don't lobby. We just educate and advocate.
Okay, that's great. How so you've been around for a couple years, or coming up on your 2-year anniversary, it sounds like.
We'll hit our 2 year.
How has that been going? Have you how's your audience look?
Yeah, it's growing substantially.
Okay, great. How big is your audience at this point in terms of?
We've got just over 1,000 members, individual members, and we've got about 12 corporate members. And I tell you, our corporate members really help provide the resources necessary to continue the discussion. So an individual membership is $35 a year. And so that is just saying, hey, I'm willing to give you $35 so I can be part of the conversation. That's kind of your buy-in. And then our corporate members help with the resources necessary to have the events that we need to have, that sponsor podcasts and webinars, that sponsor in-person events when we come through this COVID situation and we can get together in person again. We look forward to having those in-person events because nothing's better than face-to-face discussions so that you can get to those difficult conversations that we need to have. So we're constantly growing. We did help advocate for the stand-up of the Space Force Caucus in the House and the Senate. And so we're very proud of that as an organization because, that, again, it's about educating our lawmakers. And so we're helping to provide that education through that caucus. We've had webinars with just about every senior leader in the Space Force. And so we're continuing to engage with the Space Force and then even go to the space warfighter, have a discussion with what you and I would consider the space warfighter and talk to them about what they're doing. So those are podcasts and webinars that we've got on our website. We hosted a social for our corporate members and Space Operations Command senior leadership and U.S. Air Force Academy senior leadership to talk about what needs to be done from a industry perspective to ensure the workforce that's necessary to help the Space Force mission is developed. Because if you look on LinkedIn, you can see plenty of job opportunities for professionals who are interested in getting in the space domain and helping out the Space Force. But typically they require 5 years of, demonstrated expertise in that specific mission set and a security clearance. And now, I don't know about you, but I don't see a lot of college students coming out of college with an understanding of the space domain and a security clearance. And so that's something we have to think about, as a private nonprofit, is how do we help develop that workforce? So we're looking at concepts to stand up a commercial civil space education training, a space battle lab at the Air Force Academy so that we can see the newest technologies, because like we said earlier, it's tough to visualize. So you have to be able to visualize the space environment to see what the potential impacts are to operations if a critical national security asset is lost. And so those are things we're doing at the Space Force Association, and then we'll continue to have those conversations.
That's really interesting. We stood up a site for it was in the Natural Resources Careers. So the site is actually nrcareers.org a number of years ago. And the mission there was to try to help educate students at a very young age and then nurture that education through junior high school, and into college around the idea and all of the opportunities that exist within the natural resource careers area. So forestry, data science, firefighting, et cetera. And really trying to get people on board at a very early age around this idea that there was a viable pathway to a desirous career in natural resources. And I think that with Space Force, and particularly some of the challenges with making sure that people have security clearances. I'm not an expert on security clearance by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly getting people educated and on that path and understanding of that path at an early age could be advantageous. So that might be an opportunity for you guys to start that conversation at a much earlier phase in people's lifespan, I guess.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and that's why we are honored to have on our advisory council Emily Calandrelli, who is a NASA engineer, previous NASA engineer, and she's got a website called the Space Gal, and her entire mission is to engage with grade schoolers about the importance of STEM. And so she is all about getting the word out and starting that at such an early age. So we're honored to have her on our advisory council and working with her to engage with folks, to your point, connect the dot between grade schoolers all the way up through high school, college, and then into industry. So there's an understood career path for future space professionals who may or may not want to join the Space Force, but they understand what the path is to get involved in the space domain, in the space industry, or even in civil space if they're interested. And then we're working with colleges to ensure that there are degrees out there that focus on Space Force engineering requirements and engaging with those folks now for application. Because it's real easy if I'm going to university and I'm taking a class in engineering, it really is nice to see the application as opposed to just learning the curriculum and the technology. And you say, well, this is how you apply it in support of the Space Force mission. And so those are things we're working on today. And like I said, really excited to have Emily part of our team.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and really, yeah, I think trying to encourage kids to embrace STEM at an early age is that's a great goal just in and of itself. And then as it applies to kind of this bigger thinking future opportunity, that just kind of increases the power of that. I think it's really cool to hear that you have someone on board who's helping out with that. Are there any other kind of educational programs that you have implemented or are looking to implement?
Yeah, so we've got a PhD retired Air Force officer who is leading up our space education committee, Dr. Michael Martindale. And he, along with Dr. Mir Sadat, who is involved in national space policy, both now are co-editors for the Space Force Journal. And that's a peer-reviewed online journal that is published quarterly. But that's the start of trying to get the thoughts out about what the critical components are to support the Space Force. So those discussions take place there. Of course, as you know, anytime you publish anything, you've got to back that up. How did that person become an individual who is able to be published? And so you've got to gain the credibility and the credentials necessary to be the voice for that specific topic. And so now what we're doing is we're engaging with industry and we're engaging with the school districts, specific school districts, and we're looking to engage with the ROTC programs in the universities and the junior ROTC programs to bring in the space curriculum into those programs so that people can start to understand what it means. Just like anybody would become an aerospace engineer, what does it mean to become just a space engineer, and what type of expertise is industry looking for, the civil sector, the commercial sector. And so those are definitely things we want to continue to foster.
Yeah, it feels like there are opportunities to create materials that draw people in to the organization. So kind of during what we would call the attract phase, where creating online resources, materials that help tell that story and help paint that picture for what a career trajectory might look like, and then support that kind of at every phase of that career trajectory, and then just getting people, particularly as they get older and are starting to actually think, what should my line of studies be, and who should I be talking to? Just facilitating those conversations and enabling people to have access to that kind of knowledge would be really beneficial.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing, that's exactly right, is we're engaging with some of the most junior Space Force second lieutenants who are focused on the space industry and have started their own group to talk about that exact thing that you're mentioning, which is the professional development. What are the critical issues that they need to be thinking about? That's something they're developing themselves, and we're engaging with them to ensure that those conversations are taking place. And so we'll continue to develop that relationship out. But really, it gets back to the point of, if I want to get involved in a space career, whether it's military, civil, or commercial, academia, how would I do that? What's my path look like? And to your point, you have to define that path and then iterate based on folks going down that path and saying, hey, this is where we need to improve. And this is the type of information we need to increase so that we can be, again, a spacefaring nation that we already are, but we need to continue to evolve that discussion for folks.
Well, there's certainly so much opportunity right now in just space in general, where people are starting to talk about travel, and they're certainly SpaceX and all of those amazing things that are going on that are bringing it into the private sector. So it feels like there is a really great opportunity for you to simply educate people around what it takes to have a career here, and then be able to peel off the right kinds of people for Space Force, which would be even an entry. I mean, I know that there are tons of people who go into the military to get great training in a particular field that they know that they want to come out and work in, and so similarly, there's just a growing amount of additional opportunity outside of Space Force that people can tap into as part of a career path.
You bet. And just look at what Elon Musk has been able to do, independent, I'm sure, of the good opinion of others. And he just went out and said it can be done, because he said the biggest expense and launch is building the rocket. And every time we build one and launch one, we throw it away. And he said, well, I think I can do that better if I just bring that rocket, that booster, back to Earth and reuse it. And everyone said, you're crazy. That can't be done. And then he did it. And it just turned the entire game on its ear. And now you've got the Inspiration 4 mission, that you've got the first, just local civilians that are now going into orbit later on this year. And so that's a tremendous example of exactly what you just said. The opportunities for folks to get involved in the space domain, to go into space. I think we're going to see. Did you ever think in your lifetime that you would see folks riding on rockets, going into orbit and spending days in orbit as a civilian? I never thought that was going to happen. And so to see it happening is just phenomenal.
Well, it certainly was science fiction in terms of what our expectations were. But yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing that as an emerging, economic sector in terms of a pathway for careers as well as revenue and entertainment, I guess, for lack of a better word. It'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve, and how we move civilians into space in terms of of commercial endeavors, because my guess is that those opportunities are certainly going to open up.
Yeah, I think so. I think Inspiration 4 is just a perfect example of that, where you've got civilians now going into space. We had a conversation not too long ago with then it was the chief director of operations for the Space Force. At the time, it was Brigadier General Deanna Burt. It's now Major General Burt, and she's the Combined Forces Space Component Commander. And in an interview with her, we talked about the protection of those civilians in space, what that would look like. And she brought up the analogy of the Lewis and Clark expedition. As Lewis and Clark moved west, and here I am in Montana talking about Lewis and Clark, actually in Lewis and Clark County. And as they moved west, they needed to set up outposts to protect our national interests as we moved west and as we explored the West that was completely, unknown to us before then. And so I think the same is going to be, and she uses that analogy to talk about how the Space Force might have the opportunity to protect and set up forts and outposts in space to protect those commercial endeavors. As people start mining these natural resources that are in space,
right?
How do you protect that to ensure we don't have piracy in space? I mean, these are just concepts, of course, but the conversations need to be had so we can talk about that and build that future.
Yeah, it's just there's so much to discover there. No, kind of. I don't think that was a pun, but no pun intended. It's just an amazing opportunity that we have that is going to require a lot of innovative thinking, and there is so much technological advancement that's made through these types of organizations like Space Force would bring to the table. Do you see what do you see the next phase as you build this membership and try and bring more and more people into the awareness of Space Force and all of the good things that it'll bring to everyone? What's the next phase? Is what do you see you're evolving to?
Yeah. So what we're doing now is, if you look at this, and the number of people who want to get involved, you've got to set up the organizational structure to allow folks to get involved. And so what we've done is we've set up a West Coast region, a mountain region, a Northeast region, a Southeast region, and an international region. And so as folks sign up, they sign up based on where they're at. And as you know, as soon as you start to identify where folks are at, they can get together and start having discussions amongst themselves to say, hey, this is what the West Coast is worried about, because this is what this is the capability and the benefit we bring to the discussion. Same with the mountain region. Every region's going to have its expertise. I think, honestly, what you're going to see is you'll see each state getting involved in the space domain. And even if you look at Starlink, and again another Elon Musk initiative, I could foresee each state now having the resources necessary to augment the military by providing capabilities for the state in terms of natural disasters and responses to weather that's happening. How do you have that communication flow, and how much of that is reliant on the space domain? Those types of things, I think, that are really going to take off, is seeing that technology being used for each state's purpose and each governor's purpose to ensure that their constituents in that respective state have the capabilities they need and the resources necessary to get the information and be able to transmit information as necessary, so that they can be aware of either natural disasters or weather patterns, or cold fronts or drought conditions or fire patterns, or anything else. So it's really about that information flow. So I see that as kind of the next couple steps, is allowing the regions to evolve and develop, and then allowing the conversations to happen in respective states to talk about how each of us can contribute to the space discussion, which ultimately, as we've seen in the past,
That's
has always come from the space or the military community, but I think we're seeing that in reverse now a little bit, where civil commercial industry are helping to inform the Space Force mission and the military mission. And so I think we're going to see that continue to evolve, where that discussion can happen more transparently and more often.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see it come into shape, and even if you look at NASA and how much information and science they're putting behind climate change, for example, in terms of just providing data and really giving us insight into what's going on in our climate. I can completely see. You mentioned Starlink and its capabilities as bringing internet and that kind of service to everyone on the planet. As those things just expand, you have opportunities for measurement as well as for distribution of information. And so it's really cool to see how people are thinking about the future of space, travel and exploration and utilization.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we now have each service, as we talked about, has its geographic area that it's responsible for. The Navy has all the oceans worldwide. The Army's got, all the different land masses that it needs to be prepared to protect and defend. The Air Force has its geographic limit is the skies, up to now 70,000 feet. And once you get above 70,000 feet, now it's the Space Force, 70,000 feet out to, past the geosynchronous orbit. And now you can't help but then extrapolate to, what happens when we get to Mars? Because Elon Musk, I think, and we're going to see here very shortly, in the next few years, maybe 10, 20 years, he's going to be on Mars, or at least what he's started, he's going to have folks on Mars. And so how do we then, move out to those realms and ensure that those assets and resources are protected?
Right. Well, we, historically have always needed a police force of some sort. And so it's not outside of the breaking the mold at all, to think that we're going to need that as we move farther and farther into space. So are there challenges that you are seeing in terms of people's perceptions of Space Force versus kind of how historically space has been treated as this non-combative zone? Are people latching on to that protection component to a great degree, or have you gotten past that?
Oh, it's interesting. No, that's the full spectrum is being examined right now, and there was a event last week called Blue Marble Week that Foundation for the Future puts on, and this conversation came up. And I led a talk called the Evolving the Space Warfighter. And people took offense to that. They're like, wait a second, you got a bunch of warmongers in space? And that wasn't the point at all. The point is we have to be able to develop the culture that these folks are essentially fighting through an adversarial approach to their domain. And they've got the resources, information, technology, and authority and autonomy to do that. Because again, our reliance on space, it's hard to characterize holistically. So folks, when they say, well, we don't want any war in space, no, nobody wants a war in space, but we have to be able to fight into the space domain just in case there is. And we have to be trained, just like we don't want another major theater war. But the fact is we're training pilots and we're training soldiers and we're training mariners every day for that eventuality, but people don't blink an eye. They say, well, that's that domain. Well, this domain's no different. We have to protect this domain just like we do every other domain. So there are folks that are still kind of reluctant to say space warfighter, but that's going to be an aspect of this that we just have to get to and work through very quickly as a nation. The challenges are that where the nation is not sure. You've got folks that are talking about peaceful use of space, but when 2007 happened and China launched a direct ascent ASAT, uh, that kind of went out the door, because now you have to say, well, what happens if? And we have to know, do we have a resilient architecture to ensure that the space superiority mission can be accomplished? So we've been talking about this for a while. That was one of my frustrations in the Air Force, is I couldn't say the space is a warfighting domain. I had to say we have to protect and defend the space missions as necessary. But now folks are saying space is a warfighting domain, and I think my recommendation is we embrace it and figure out exactly what that means, so that folks can understand and they don't have to be fearful that we're going to have a war in space. Our intent, I believe, is to ensure we don't have a war in space.
Right. Well, I think in terms of, as we become more and more reliant upon technology and exploration in that domain in space, the opportunities for misuse of that domain or aggressive activities within that domain become higher as well. And so just having that in terms of how we perceive, or how we place ourselves into that framework, to have a preventative force, I think is something that probably, obviously very, very much does need to be explored.
That's right. I mean, it's no different than the Navy moving its battleship into an area to prevent piracy, or the Air Force setting up a no-fly zone to enforce international standards. It's no different. We just have to have the option as a country to enforce those national security objectives laid out by the Secretary of Defense and our president. And so we have to be prepared for those activities, and then be able to back that up with action. We can't just talk about it. We have to say, yeah, and we will, execute a mission to ensure our access to space is secured.
That's great. So you mentioned events a while back. How did you and your team kind of handle events in the past year, given that in person has been a bit more of a challenge in the last 12 months or so?
Yeah, I think it was a level setter. I really do. I think it provided opportunities for young, small organizations like the Space Force Association to really have a voice, because people weren't traveling to events. So what we did is we tried to do a virtual event every month. And so we just set up interviews on a monthly basis, and we advertised it that we were having the event, for folks to be involved in the conversations. And then, of course, we recorded it like we're doing today. And then we posted that to a website so that folks can have access to it. And that's what we did for our events. And yeah, as we move out of this COVID situation, this COVID environment, we are looking to have a future event called the Space Warfighters Conference in the Denver area, probably in October.
Okay.
And so that announcement is being made right now, as we do this podcast. That's our plan, is to host the Space Warfighter Conference in Denver in the October timeframe, so that we can get together as a community and talk about the criticality of the space domain, and how we can continue to support the Space Force as they evolve as a service, and continue to develop the professionals that they need to do their space superiority mission.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love the commitment that you made to having events on a regular basis, and certainly there are. What you said is absolutely a valuable point to make, that it was sort of a game leveler when in-person events tend to be pretty expensive to put on, and so smaller organizations have a tough time breaking into that space, just because of costs associated with a major event, or not being able to put on one big enough to kind of change people's minds or bring people in or do the things that need to be done. So yeah, I mean, just embracing the technology that we've had available in terms of online, remote conferencing. I think that's a really great way to put it. And it's cool to see how you really committed to that and made it happen. Were there any, with your membership, were those the people who typically showed up for these virtual conferences, or were you bringing in people from all over the place?
Yeah, we're bringing in folks from everywhere. We are a inclusive organization. We're not an exclusive organization. So we like to just kind of cast the net, and anyone who wants to take part of the conversation, we'll invite them in. And so we made this first year, we made a lot of the events free to folks, to press and to anyone else who just wanted to. Um, sign up for the events. We did put up a donation page, so if folks wanted to donate for our time, we'd appreciate that. And so we created that. So we provided that opportunity. But if they donated, you bet, come on in and be part of the conversation. And so what we did is we would engage with senior Space Force leaders and talk with them and do a Q&A with them for about 20, 30 minutes. And then we'd open it up for 15, 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And so if you're part of this discussion, then you could type in and say, hey, I've got a question for, this general or this chief master sergeant. And so that's how we set that up. And it was great. We had a lot of members that would sign up. But honestly, based on our current business model, what they would say is, hey, is this going to be recorded? And can I just watch this later on? And of course, the response is, yeah, you bet. We'll record it, and later on you can watch it. So it's really just about, like I said, just getting the information out. Now that's going to change. That business model will change a little bit with our new website that we launched last week. So we will have some content in front of the paywall, and we're going to have some content that's going to be members only content. So that really does motivate folks to become a member so they can get access to that content that is set aside for members only.
That's great to hear that you have materials available for people both in front of and behind a paywall. I think that's a challenge that a lot of nonprofits kind of run into, is whether they put everything outside and fail to start to build that list, or put everything behind a paywall, at which point they aren't able to attract. And so really, the way that we tend to look at that life cycle is being able to bring people in, so attracting them, then creating relationships with them, so relationship building and getting them to convert to to connect with you and become a potential person with whom you're starting to establish that relationship, and you're able to create conversations. So that's the next phase. And a lot of times that needs to happen with materials that are kind of quasi behind a paywall, where you have something that draws them to the site that's informational and free and doesn't require any sort of transaction, and then put something else behind an email grab. So essentially trying to figure out ways to enable you to continue that conversation. And so in that connect phase, collecting an email before you distribute something of value. So that might just be, you can come to this webinar, or this, you can sit in on this event for free. We just want to get your email address in order to be able to ask you questions about the event afterwards. So coming from a real position of altruism, where you're essentially getting people into the fold, but not asking them for a monetary transaction, but you're giving value, they're getting value, et cetera. And then from there is just continuing to escalate those engagements to either turn them into donors or members or volunteers, if you guys have a volunteer component to your organization. And then the last phase being that in Inspire, where really getting them to be so thrilled with what you've provided that they're wanting to share that with their communities and really help spread that word and then continue to be involved. So it's cool to see that you're doing some of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Stu. Thanks for summarizing that so eloquently. because that's exactly what we're trying to do. It's tough. Anytime you create a opportunity for a new discussion, people get excited about it. But if you don't provide them the opportunity to have the discussion in an organized manner, then they'll just go have the discussion somewhere else. So what we're trying to do is create exactly that, create a forum for the discussion. So yeah, we've got a volunteer section now of the website that is volunteer only. So if you sign up to be a volunteer with SFA, you go into a volunteer group now that is being managed by senior volunteers that help facilitate that discussion in the various regions. So you're exactly right. That's exactly the model we're trying to adopt.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that, that really trying to get people to understand how they can become more involved is always a great thing to do. You've brought them in and you've done all this work to kind of get them to engage in the first place. Then, just creating opportunities to have those conversations. And I love that you use the word forum, because it does imply, a two-way kind of conversation. It's a relationship. It's not just someone standing on a soapbox and yelling out there that Space Force is neat or whatever it is that you're yelling. It's, it's facilitating conversations and building relationships.
Yeah. And that's a perfect point. This isn't about me. This isn't about my story. It's really about how to get that space warfighter the tools necessary to do their job, which is going to bring, again, civilian, academia, commercial industry, policymakers into that discussion. But we need to think about what the space warfighter needs. And so that's the only soapbox I'll have, is to provide a forum by which the space warfighter can stand up and say, this is the capabilities I need. If you want me to do the space superiority mission that you've tasked me to do in support of our national security objectives. And that's really the only message that Space Force Association is trying to get out and help foster and facilitate that discussion.
Well, you're certainly in a really dynamic and growing industry. And I've always just been, very interested in space and particularly the science of space. And so it's really cool to hear how you're planning for the protection of all of those people and resources that are going to be, participating in that journey.
Yes, sir. No, Stu, it's great.
How can people find? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, everyone can relate. I grew up on Star Wars. And so everyone can relate to what the opportunity and potential is. The question becomes, how do we get there from here? And really, it brings a source of national pride, not just from the U.S. standpoint, but every nation around the globe talks about their space capabilities. And it really is a sense of national pride for every country. You got the UAE now that's got the Mars rover in orbit that's going to descend here and land on Mars. That's a huge sense of national pride. So space brings that sense. And so how do we continue to foster that and get people and keep people excited about that domain? And I think they look at the Space Force and they go, oh my goodness, finally, there's an opportunity to be involved. And now it allows the opportunity then to organize, again, all of these different components in support of that national security strategy, so that, we all have a part to play if we want to. And so that's a blast.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how do people find out more about the Space Force Association?
Yeah. So the SFA.org website, unfortunately, was taken. That's, I think it's Surfers Federation Association.org. So if you want to learn about surfing, you can go to SFA.org. But if you want to learn about the Space Force Association, you have to put a US in front of it. So it's USSFA.org. and folks can learn all about what we're doing at the Space Force Association, and they can become a member for $35, and they can, based on that membership, then have access to the forums that we've just created so that they can be part of that growing discussion in an organized way. There's plenty of opportunity out there, I think, for social media, for folks to just talk about, hey, this is what we want to do, or this is what I think, or Reddit channels where you can go in and just kind of pontificate about what it is you think. I think that's all great. But if you want to be part of an organized discussion, come on over to the Space Force Association and be part of that organized discussion.
I think that is a great great thing to have people do. In terms of additional action, I like to end all of my shows with an ask from my guests to give people something to do that can make the world a better place or further their education. What would you want people to do after listening to our show today?
Don't use Netflix as a source of understanding for the Space Force. I'd recommend just go to YouTube and type in Space Force Association as a starting point. But there are a lot of other organizations out there that are helping to get the word out about what the Space Force is. So I would just ask folks to educate themselves on what the Space Force is. Do a little bit of research. Go check out Emily Calandrelli over at thespacegal.com and see what she's doing to help get folks, very young folks, interested in STEM. And then talk to your local policymakers, your lawmakers, your elected officials, and talk about the importance of the Space Force and ask them, hey, what are you doing in support of the Space Force? I'm just curious. I want to know. Because that is really where it matters, is ensuring that our elected officials understand the criticality of the space domain, and they understand the difference between Space Force versus NASA versus U.S. Spacecom. These are interesting topics that people just tend to confuse, and they just say, well, isn't the Space Force NASA? Well, no, it's not at all. It's quite different. And so I would just ask folks to become educated about what the Space Force is and how important the Space Force is to our national security.
Well, it sounds like USSFA.org would be a great place for people to start. I really appreciate you being on the show today, and look forward to hearing more about how things evolve at SFA.
Thank you so much, Stu. It's outlets like yours that allow folks to have these types of conversations. It's extremely important what you're doing. So I really appreciate your time today and for Relish This and what you're doing in support of nonprofits. So thanks for your efforts, and looking forward to having future conversations about the growth and the development of the Space Force Association.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and I will hope to talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon, Stu. Thank you so much.
Bye. All right, there you have it. Another great episode of Relish This. Thanks for listening. If you would like to learn more about how to apply the audience engagement cycle to expand your organization's mission, there are two things you can do. Right now, you can go to missionuncomfortablebook.com to download a copy of my book. And while you're there, you can get your purpose-driven marketing score to see where you can unearth some gold for your organization. If you'd like to listen to back episodes of the show or sign up to be a guest, go to relishstudio.com/podcast. That's it for this week. I'll be back next week for another great episode of Relish This.